Welcome to Dark Echoes Crime, where we dive into the darkest corners of justice, betrayal, and karma. Buckle up because what you're about to hear is darker than anything you've imagined. The courtroom was silent except for the rhythmic tapping of expensive Italian leather shoes against polished marble. 17-year-old Ashton Blackwell III sat at the defendant's table with the kind of smirk that could curdle milk. His perfectly styled blonde hair, designer suit tailored to fit his athletic frame, and the diamond-studded watch on his wrist screamed wealth and entitlement. He looked less like someone on trial for attempted murder and more like someone attending a yacht club luncheon. His lawyer, Gerald Pemberton, was a shark in a $15,000 suit, known for getting the children of the wealthy out of everything from DUIs to assault charges. Pemberton leaned back in his chair, occasionally whispering reassurances to Ashton, who would nod and flash that infuriating smirk again. They both knew the game. They'd played it before. Money talked, and in their world, it screamed loud enough to drown out justice. Across the aisle sat Marcus Chen, a 16-year-old scholarship student at Pembroke Academy, one of the most elite private schools in Connecticut. Marcus wore a donated suit that didn't quite fit right, the sleeves too short, the pants too long. His mother sat beside him, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She worked 3 jobs to keep Marcus in that school, believing education was the key to a better life. Now she watched her son, his face still bearing faint scars from the attack that nearly killed him, and she prayed for justice in a system that rarely delivered it to people like them. The charges were severe. Attempted murder, aggravated assault, and conspiracy. 6 months earlier, Ashton and 3 of his friends had cornered Marcus in the school's basement after a basketball game. What started as typical bullying had escalated into something monstrous. They'd beaten Marcus so badly that he'd spent 2 weeks in a coma. The doctor said it was a miracle he survived. The attack had been vicious, calculated, and according to witnesses, Ashton had led the assault with disturbing enthusiasm. But this wasn't just about a beating. The prosecution had evidence that Ashton had planned it, that he'd brought a metal pipe to school specifically for this purpose, that he'd encouraged his friends to film it on their phones like it was entertainment. The videos existed. The evidence was damning. And yet, Ashton sat there, confident as ever because he knew something the public didn't. His father, Ashton Blackwell II, had connections everywhere. Political donations, business partnerships, country club memberships with judges and prosecutors. The Blackwell family had been untouchable for 3 generations, built on old money from steel manufacturing and new money from tech investments. They owned half the real estate in Greenwich and had their names on hospital wings and university buildings. When Ashton II learned his son was in trouble, he made calls. Lots of calls. The trial had been delayed twice already, each time buying the defense more time to prepare, to coach witnesses, to make evidence mysteriously become less clear. The media had covered it extensively, with public opinion sharply divided. Some saw a privileged kid who thought he could get away with anything. Others, influenced by carefully planted stories about Marcus being a troubled student with behavioral issues, questioned whether the incident was really as one-sided as it seemed. But today was the day. Judge Evelyn Hargrove was presiding, and she had a reputation. In her 23 years on the bench, she'd never been swayed by wealth or status. She was known for being tough, fair, and occasionally terrifying. Defense attorneys hated drawing her courtroom. She'd sent the sons of senators to prison and refused to budge when political pressure mounted. If anyone could see through the Blackwell money, it was her. Ashton didn't seem worried, though. His smirk never wavered as the judge entered the courtroom. Everyone rose. Judge Hargrove was a woman in her early 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She wore her black robes with an authority that filled the room. As she took her seat at the bench, her right hand briefly touched her left hand, almost unconsciously, tracing a scar that ran from her wrist halfway up her forearm. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They presented the medical reports showing Marcus's injuries: fractured skull, broken ribs, punctured lung, severe internal bleeding. They showed the videos recovered from the phones of Ashton's accomplices. Though the footage was so brutal, the judge warned the gallery before it played. People gasped. Marcus's mother wept. Ashton's expression barely changed. Then came the witnesses. Students from Pembroke Academy testified about the months of bullying that preceded the attack. They described how Ashton had tormented Marcus relentlessly, mocking his second-hand clothes, his mother's job as a cleaner, his scholarship status. They recounted incidents where Ashton had poured chemicals on Marcus's science project, slashed his bicycle tires, spread rumors that Marcus had cheated on exams. The pattern was clear. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was the culmination of a sustained campaign of cruelty. One particularly damning witness was Emma Hartfield, Ashton's ex-girlfriend. She testified that 2 days before the attack, Ashton had told her he was going to teach the scholarship kid a lesson he'd never forget. When she'd asked what he meant, he'd laughed and said Marcus needed to learn his place. Emma had broken up with Ashton after the attack, disgusted by what he'd done, and now she sat on the witness stand, visibly shaken but determined to tell the truth. The defense tried to poke holes in the testimony. Pemberton suggested that the videos didn't clearly show who started the fight, that Marcus might have provoked the incident, that teenage boys sometimes got into scuffles that escalated beyond anyone's intentions. He painted Ashton as a good kid from a good family who'd made a mistake in the heat of the moment. He brought in character witnesses, teachers who spoke of Ashton's academic achievements, coaches who praised his leadership on the lacrosse team, family friends who described him as polite and respectful. But the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution had text messages where Ashton coordinated with his friends, telling them to meet him in the basement and to bring the pipe. They had a teacher who'd seen Ashton hiding the pipe in his gym locker that morning. They had Marcus's testimony, delivered in a quiet, steady voice that trembled only slightly as he described the attack, the fear he'd felt, the moment he thought he was going to die. By the third day of trial, it seemed impossible that Ashton would walk free. The prosecution rested their case with confidence. The defense presented their arguments, weaker than expected, relying heavily on the idea that this was a tragic accident blown out of proportion. Closing arguments came and went. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Marcus's mother sobbed with relief. Supporters who'd packed the gallery cheered. The prosecution team exchanged satisfied nods. And for the first time, Ashton's smirk faltered. His face went pale. His father, sitting in the front row, looked like he'd been punched. Gerald Pemberton immediately began talking about appeals, about how they'd fight this, about how this wasn't over. But the verdict was only the first part. Now came sentencing. In most cases, sentencing would happen weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare arguments about what punishment fit the crime. But Judge Hargrove had scheduled it for that same afternoon. She wanted this resolved. She wanted to send a message. The courtroom reconvened 3 hours later. Ashton sat at the defendant's table, no longer smirking, but his chin was still raised with that trademark Blackwell defiance. His father had made more calls during the break. Rumors swirled that political favors were being called in, that pressure was being applied to the judge through every channel imaginable. The Blackwells were not going to accept this quietly. Judge Hargrove entered, and again everyone rose. She sat, looked at the papers before her, and then her gaze fixed on Ashton. The room held its breath. Before she could speak, Gerald Pemberton stood. He launched into a passionate plea for leniency. He argued that Ashton was just 17, that he had his whole life ahead of him, that sending him to adult prison would destroy his future. He talked about rehabilitation, about how Ashton had already learned his lesson, about how the Blackwell family would ensure he received counseling and therapy. He suggested community service, probation, perhaps a stint in a juvenile facility, but certainly not adult prison. He emphasized that Ashton came from a good family, that he had opportunities to contribute to society, that punishing him too harshly would serve no purpose. The subtext was clear. Ashton was wealthy, white, and well-connected. Surely that deserved consideration. The prosecution countered with Marcus's impact statement. Marcus stood, his voice stronger now, and he spoke directly to the judge. He talked about the nightmares he still had, about the pain that still woke him up at night, about how he couldn't walk through dark spaces anymore without panicking. He talked about the months of physical therapy, about missing half the school year, about the scholarship he nearly lost because he couldn't keep up with his coursework while recovering. He talked about how Ashton had never once apologized, had never shown a shred of remorse. He ended by saying that if the justice system meant anything, it had to apply equally to everyone regardless of how much money their family had. Judge Hargrove listened to it all without expression. When Marcus finished and sat down, she looked at the papers before her again, then at Ashton. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke. Her voice was measured, calm, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. She addressed the court, speaking about the nature of the crime, the premeditation involved, the brutality of the attack, and the complete lack of remorse shown by the defendant. She talked about how the law existed to protect the vulnerable from those who would abuse their power and privilege. She noted that this was not a momentary lapse in judgment but a calculated act of violence. Then she turned to sentencing. for attempted murder, she could impose anything from a few years in juvenile detention to a maximum sentence in adult prison. The room waited. She began listing the sentence, and with each word, Ashton's face grew paler. 25 years in adult prison. No possibility of parole for 15 years. Additional years for the assault and conspiracy charges to run consecutively. When she finished, the total was staggering. Ashton would be in his 40s before he'd even be eligible for parole. The courtroom exploded again. Ashton's father jumped to his feet, shouting that this was a travesty, that they'd appeal, that they'd sue, that this wasn't over. Ashton himself seemed to be in shock, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Gerald Pemberton was already frantically taking notes, preparing the appeal paperwork in his mind. But Judge Hargrove wasn't finished. She raised her hand, calling for silence, and the authority in that gesture was so powerful that even Ashton Blackwell II stopped shouting and sat down. She looked directly at Ashton, her dark eyes boring into him, and she said something no one expected. She said that before the bailiffs took him away, there was something he needed to know. Something that had bearing on this case. Something personal. The room went dead silent. Even the reporters stopped typing. What could a judge possibly have to say that was personal? Judges were supposed to be impartial, removed from the cases they presided over. What was happening? Judge Hargrove stood up from behind the bench, something judges almost never did during proceedings. She stepped down to the floor level, walking slowly toward the defense table. Her right hand still rested on her left forearm, over that long scar. She stopped a few feet from Ashton, close enough that he had to look up at her. And then she spoke, and what she said would haunt that courtroom forever. She told him that 28 years ago she wasn't a judge. She was 15 years old, a scholarship student at a different elite private school in Massachusetts. She was the daughter of a single mother who worked as a cleaner, just like Marcus's mother. She wore donated clothes. She studied harder than anyone because she knew education was her only way out of poverty. And she was bullied mercilessly by a group of wealthy students who thought she didn't belong there. The leader of that group was a boy named Ashton Blackwell. Not Ashton III sitting before her now. Ashton II. The defendant's father. The courtroom gasped collectively. Ashton's eyes widened. His father, still in the front row, went rigid. Judge Hargrove continued. She said that for 3 years Ashton II and his friends had made her life a living hell. They'd done everything his son had done to Marcus and worse. They destroyed her belongings, spread vicious rumors, physically intimidated her. But the worst incident came in her senior year. She'd been working late in the school library, and Ashton II and 3 of his friends had cornered her in a stairwell. They'd mocked her, pushed her around, and when she tried to leave, one of them had grabbed her arm. She'd fought back harder than they expected, and in the struggle she'd fallen down the stairs. Her arm had gone through a window at the landing, shattering the glass. The cut had been so deep that she'd nearly bled out before help arrived. The scar on her forearm was from that night, a permanent reminder of what unchecked privilege and cruelty could do. The incident had been covered up. Ashton II's father, Ashton Blackwell I, had made calls, just like his son was doing now. Money had changed hands. The school had been encouraged to call it an accident. The other boys had claimed she'd been drunk, that she'd fallen on her own, that they'd tried to help her. Her mother couldn't afford a lawyer. There was no justice, no consequences for Ashton II and his friends. They'd graduated, gone on to Ivy League schools, inherited their family fortunes, and never thought about her again. But she'd thought about them. Every single day. As she'd worked her way through college and law school, as she'd struggled with PTSD from that night, as she'd built her career in the justice system, she'd thought about them. She'd thought about how the system had failed her, how money and power had protected boys who deserved punishment. And she'd vowed that if she ever had the power to change that, she would. When she'd seen the name Ashton Blackwell III on her docket 6 months ago, she'd almost recused herself. Almost. But then she'd read the case file. She'd seen Marcus's injuries, seen the video footage, read the pattern of bullying. It was identical. History repeating itself, one generation to the next, because Ashton II had learned no lessons. He'd faced no consequences. He'd raised his son to believe that wealth meant immunity, that people like Marcus, people like the girl Evelyn Hargrove used to be, didn't matter. She'd stayed on the case because she'd realized something important. This wasn't about revenge. It was about breaking a cycle. It was about making sure that this Ashton Blackwell faced the consequences his father never did, not because of who his father was, but in spite of it. She'd presided over the trial with absolute impartiality, had made rulings based purely on law and evidence, had given the defense every benefit of the doubt. The guilty verdict had come from the jury, not from her. But now, in sentencing, she had discretion. And she'd used it. The sentence she'd imposed wasn't about her past. It was about Ashton III's actions, about what he'd done to Marcus, about what he would do again if he wasn't stopped. But if her past gave her extra clarity, extra certainty that harsh punishment was necessary to break this cycle of entitled cruelty, then so be it. She finished speaking and looked at Ashton III. She asked if he understood. Did he understand that his father's crimes had finally come due, paid by the son who'd followed too perfectly in his footsteps? Did he understand that karma was real, that it was patient, that it had waited 28 years but it always collected? Ashton couldn't speak. His face was ashen. His father was on his feet again, but this time he wasn't shouting. He was staring at Judge Hargrove, and recognition slowly dawned on his face. He remembered her. Not as the powerful judge she'd become, but as the scared scholarship girl from that stairwell. And in that moment he understood that everything he'd built, all the power and money he'd accumulated, couldn't protect his son from the consequences of sins that started with him. Judge Hargrove returned to the bench. She ordered the bailiffs to take Ashton III into custody. As they handcuffed him and led him away, he finally broke. He started crying, calling for his father, saying this wasn't fair. But his father just sat there, frozen, unable to look away from the judge's scar, that physical reminder of what he'd done and what it had cost. The courtroom slowly emptied. Marcus and his mother stayed to thank the prosecutors, tears of relief streaming down both their faces. Some reporters rushed out to break the story, while others lingered, trying to process what they'd witnessed. This wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning. In the days that followed, the story exploded. The media coverage was intense. Legal experts debated whether Judge Hargrove should have recused herself, but most concluded that she'd handled everything by the book. The verdict and sentence were legally sound, based on evidence and law, not personal bias. If anything, her disclosure after sentencing showed remarkable integrity, a willingness to be transparent about her connection even though she wasn't legally required to reveal it. The Blackwell family's attempts to appeal failed. The sentence stood. Ashton III was transferred to an adult facility, where the reality of his situation finally sank in. Without his father's money to insulate him, without his status to protect him, he was just another inmate. And in prison, where many inmates came from the kinds of backgrounds he'd mocked and bullied, his name and his crime made him a target. But this story goes deeper. Because what Judge Hargrove revealed in that courtroom was only part of the truth. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say without compromising the trial, was even darker. That night 28 years ago, when she'd fallen and cut her arm, when she'd nearly bled out in that stairwell, Ashton Blackwell II and his friends hadn't just stood there. They hadn't called for help. Instead, they'd panicked. They'd argued about what to do, whether to get a teacher, whether to run. And in those precious minutes while they argued, she'd continued bleeding. One of the boys, a kid named Preston Whitmore, had eventually gone for help, but not before Ashton II had made them all promise to stick to the story. They'd claimed she was drunk, that she'd fallen alone, that they'd just happened to find her. Preston had reluctantly agreed, terrified of what would happen if he didn't. But the delay in getting help had nearly cost Evelyn her life. By the time the ambulance arrived, she'd lost so much blood that her heart had stopped twice on the way to the hospital. Preston Whitmore had carried the guilt of that night for decades. He'd gone on to become a doctor, perhaps trying to atone in some way. He'd never spoken publicly about what happened, bound by the pact they'd made and by his own shame. But 3 years ago, dying of cancer, he'd reached out to Evelyn. He'd found her through a legal directory and had written her a letter. In it, he'd confessed everything. He'd told her the truth about that night, about the delay, about Ashton II's insistence that they protect themselves first. He'd apologized, knowing it was inadequate, knowing it was too late, but needing to unburden himself before he died. Evelyn had read that letter dozens of times. It had confirmed what she'd always suspected, that the incident wasn't just bullying gone wrong, it was something darker, a moment where privileged boys chose to protect themselves at the cost of a girl they considered beneath them. Preston's death shortly after sending the letter meant there was no way to corroborate his confession, no way to reopen a case that had been closed for decades. But it had given Evelyn something important: closure. And certainty that Ashton II was capable of even greater cruelty than she'd experienced. When Ashton III's case came to her, she'd done her homework. She'd investigated the Blackwell family not to bias the trial, but to understand what she was dealing with. What she'd found was a pattern. Ashton II had been involved in several other incidents over the years, all hushed up, all settled with money. A sexual assault allegation in college, dismissed after a large payment to the accuser. A DUI that injured another driver, settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. Business practices that bordered on fraud, resolved through expensive lawyers and political connections. And more troubling, she'd found that Ashton II had raised his son in the same mold. Ashton III had been expelled from 2 previous schools for bullying and violent behavior, but the expulsions had been reversed after donations to school funds. He'd been arrested twice as a minor, once for vandalism and once for assault, but the charges had been dropped both times. The pattern was clear. Ashton III had been taught that actions had no consequences if you had enough money. He'd learned from his father that the world was divided into people who mattered and people who didn't, and that cruelty toward the latter was permissible. Evelyn hadn't shared any of this during the trial because it would have been prejudicial. She'd presided based solely on the evidence related to Marcus's case. But when it came time to sentence, when she had discretion within the legal guidelines, all of that context informed her decision. She knew that leniency would teach Ashton III nothing. She knew that his father's interventions had already failed to correct his behavior. She knew that without serious consequences he would hurt someone else, maybe kill someone next time. The sentence she imposed was harsh, but it was justified by the severity of his crime and the likelihood of recidivism. After the sentencing, Evelyn received both praise and criticism. Some called her a hero, applauding her for standing up to wealthy privilege. Others questioned her objectivity, suggesting that her personal history had influenced her decision inappropriately. There were calls for investigations, for ethics reviews, for the case to be overturned. But every legal expert who examined the case concluded the same thing. The trial had been fair. The verdict was supported by overwhelming evidence. The sentence was within legal guidelines for the crime. Evelyn had done nothing wrong. What fascinated people most was the revelation of the connection. The idea that karma had brought these 2 families together decades later, that the son of Evelyn's tormentor had ended up in her courtroom facing charges for committing the same kind of act, seemed almost too perfect to be coincidence. Some saw it as divine justice. Others saw it as tragic irony. But everyone agreed it was a story that exposed something important about how privilege perpetuates itself, how cruelty is often passed from generation to generation, and how the system protects the wealthy at the expense of everyone else. Marcus Chen recovered, though the scars from that attack would never fully fade. He finished high school, graduated with honors, and received a full scholarship to Yale. He wanted to become a lawyer, inspired by Judge Hargrove's example, wanting to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. His mother continued working her 3 jobs, proud beyond words of her son, grateful that the system had worked for once. Ashton Blackwell II faced his own reckoning. The publicity around the trial had exposed his past, and Preston Whitmore's widow, learning of the case, came forward with her late husband's letter. While the statute of limitations had long expired on what happened to Evelyn, the revelation destroyed Ashton II's reputation. Business partners distanced themselves. Social circles that had once welcomed the Blackwell name now closed their doors. His wife filed for divorce, unwilling to remain married to a man whose true nature had been so publicly exposed. The empire he'd built began to crumble. In a strange twist, Ashton II attempted to reach out to Evelyn. Through his lawyer, he requested a meeting, claiming he wanted to apologize, to make amends for what he'd done 28 years ago. Evelyn declined. She had no interest in his apology. It was too late, too self-serving, too obviously motivated by his current circumstances rather than genuine remorse. She'd moved past needing anything from him years ago. Her justice had come from becoming someone who could protect others from people like him. That was enough. But the story doesn't end there either. Because in prison, Ashton III had his own journey. At first, he remained defiant, convinced that his father would find a way to get him out, that the appeals would succeed, that this nightmare would end. But as months turned into years, as appeal after appeal was denied, reality set in. He was going to be in prison for a very long time. Prison was brutal for him. Without the protection of wealth and status, he was vulnerable in ways he'd never experienced. He was beaten multiple times in his first year, learning what it felt like to be on the receiving end of violence. Other inmates knew why he was there, knew he was a rich kid who'd nearly killed a scholarship student, and they had no sympathy. In their eyes, he represented everything they hated about the system that had failed them. But something unexpected happened. One of the prison counselors, a man named Jerome Washington, took an interest in Ashton's case. Jerome had grown up in poverty, had been incarcerated himself as a young man for crimes born of desperation, and had turned his life around. He believed in rehabilitation even for people like Ashton who seemed irredeemable. Jerome started meeting with Ashton regularly, pushing him to confront what he'd done and why. At first, Ashton resisted, clinging to his old defenses, blaming Marcus for being an easy target, blaming the school for not intervening, blaming everyone but himself. But Jerome was patient. He'd heard every excuse, every justification, and he knew how to break through them. Over the course of 2 years, Jerome worked with Ashton, forcing him to understand the humanity of the people he'd hurt. He made Ashton read Marcus's impact statement over and over until he could recite it from memory. He made Ashton write letters to Marcus, letters he'd never send, describing in detail what he'd done and why it was wrong. He made Ashton volunteer in the prison education program, tutoring other inmates, many of whom came from backgrounds similar to Marcus's. Slowly, painfully, Ashton began to change. The process wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments when his old arrogance and entitlement resurfaced. But gradually, genuinely, he started to understand. He started to see Marcus not as a lesser person, not as a target, but as a human being who'd suffered enormously because of him. He started to see his father not as a powerful man to emulate, but as a coward who'd taught him all the wrong lessons. He started to see himself not as a victim of an unfair system, but as someone who'd caused tremendous harm and needed to spend the rest of his life trying to make up for it. 5 years into his sentence, Ashton did something unprecedented. He wrote a letter to Judge Hargrove. In it, he didn't ask for leniency or early release. Instead, he apologized. He apologized for what he'd done to Marcus, for the pain he'd caused, for the person he'd been. He apologized for his father's actions all those years ago, acknowledging that while he couldn't undo that harm, he understood now that it was connected to his own crimes. He thanked her for the sentence she'd imposed, saying that it had saved his life, that without it he would have continued down a path that would have led to even worse acts. He said he deserved every day of the sentence and more, and that he was committed to using his time in prison to become someone different, someone better. Evelyn read the letter in her chambers. She was skeptical. She'd seen plenty of convicts claim redemption, only to reoffend the moment they were released. Words were easy. Change was hard. But something about Ashton's letter felt different. It didn't make excuses. It didn't ask for anything. It simply acknowledged the truth and accepted responsibility. She filed it away, making a note to follow up on his progress in a few years. As time passed, reports filtered back to her. Ashton had become a model prisoner. He'd earned his GED, then started college courses through a prison program. He joined a restorative justice group, where inmates took responsibility for their crimes and worked to understand the impact of their actions. He'd written a detailed letter to Marcus, which Marcus had chosen not to read, which Ashton accepted without complaint. He'd cut off contact with his father, refusing visits and letters, saying he needed to define himself separately from the Blackwell legacy. Most tellingly, when Ashton became eligible for a sentence reduction program based on good behavior and rehabilitation efforts, he declined to apply. He told Jerome that he hadn't served enough time, that Marcus deserved more than 10 years before he even considered the possibility of release, that he needed to prove to himself that his change was real and lasting. Evelyn heard about this and found herself surprised. Maybe, just maybe, Ashton III was genuinely different. Maybe the system had worked, not just in punishing him but in rehabilitating him. It didn't undo the harm he'd caused, didn't erase Marcus's trauma, didn't make the sentence she'd imposed any less necessary. But it suggested that even someone raised with every advantage, every bad lesson, every excuse for cruelty, could change if forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Marcus, meanwhile, had his own journey. He graduated from Yale Law School at the top of his class and accepted a position at a non-profit legal organization that represented low-income defendants. He could have joined a prestigious firm, made a fortune, but he chose purpose over profit. He wanted to be what Judge Hargrove had been for him, a voice for people the system overlooked. He was approached multiple times by journalists wanting to write books or produce documentaries about his case. He always declined. He didn't want to be defined by what Ashton had done to him. He wanted to be defined by what he did afterward, by how he chose to use his life. When pressed, he'd simply say that the justice system had worked for him, that Judge Hargrove had given him a gift by holding his attacker accountable, and that he was committed to extending that gift to others. He and Evelyn stayed in touch over the years. Not frequently, but occasionally she'd send him notes of congratulations when he won a difficult case or when he was profiled in legal publications. He'd send her updates on his work, on the people he was helping. They never talked about the trial directly, both understanding that some things were too heavy to revisit casually. But there was a bond between them, forged in that courtroom, a shared understanding of what it meant to overcome privilege-fueled cruelty and build something meaningful from the wreckage. 15 years after the trial, Ashton III became eligible for parole. He'd served his minimum sentence. His prison record was spotless. He had recommendations from counselors, teachers, and fellow inmates. He had a detailed reentry plan, including a job offer at a nonprofit that helped at-risk youth, housing arranged through a halfway house, and a commitment to continue therapy. The parole hearing was held in the same courthouse where he'd been sentenced. A different judge presided over parole hearings, but Evelyn requested permission to attend as an observer. She wanted to see for herself what Ashton had become. Marcus attended too. It was the first time he'd seen Ashton since the trial. Ashton was 32 now, no longer the arrogant teenager in the designer suit. He looked older, thinner, with a scar over his left eye from one of the beatings he'd endured in prison. He wore plain prison clothes and carried himself with a humility that would have been unimaginable 15 years earlier. The hearing began with standard questions about his behavior in prison, his rehabilitation programs, his plans for reentry. Ashton answered each question thoughtfully, never making excuses, always accepting responsibility. When asked if he felt he'd been punished sufficiently, he said he didn't think that was for him to judge, that Marcus was the only person whose opinion mattered on that question. Then Marcus was given the opportunity to speak. The room went silent. Everyone knew this moment could determine Ashton's fate. If Marcus opposed parole, the board would likely deny it. If Marcus supported it, Ashton had a real chance at release. Marcus stood and walked to the microphone. He looked at Ashton for a long moment, then he spoke. He said that Ashton had taken something from him that could never be fully returned. He'd taken his sense of safety, his peace of mind, his belief that hard work and decency would protect him. He'd caused physical and psychological wounds that still ached. For that, Marcus said he'd never forgive Ashton. Forgiveness wasn't owed, wasn't required, and Marcus wasn't interested in pretending otherwise. But, Marcus continued, the justice system wasn't about forgiveness. It was about accountability and rehabilitation. Ashton had been held accountable. He'd served 15 years for what he did. And based on everything Marcus had learned about Ashton's time in prison, it seemed like genuine rehabilitation had occurred. Marcus said he didn't know if Ashton's change was permanent, no one could know that, but he believed people should have the chance to prove they'd changed. Marcus said he wouldn't oppose parole. He wouldn't support it either. He would leave it to the parole board to make that decision based on the evidence. But he wanted to be clear, if Ashton was released and hurt anyone else, if this change proved to be a performance rather than real, then the failure wouldn't just be Ashton's. It would be the system's and everyone in this room who gave him a second chance. It was a powerful statement, measured and honest, neither vindictive nor naive. When Marcus sat down, Ashton was crying. He thanked Marcus, his voice breaking, saying he knew he didn't deserve Marcus's measured response, that he'd expected and would have understood hatred and opposition. He said that if he was released, he'd spend every remaining day of his life trying to earn the chance Marcus was giving him, not through words but through actions. The parole board deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, they announced their decision. Parole was granted, but with strict conditions. Ashton would be under supervision for 10 years. He'd have to maintain employment, continue therapy, submit to random drug tests, and stay away from Marcus and his family. Any violation, any legal trouble whatsoever, and he'd be sent back to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. Ashton accepted the conditions without hesitation. He was released 2 weeks later. His re-entry into society was nothing like the life he'd left behind. His father had died 3 years earlier, a heart attack brought on by stress and the collapse of his business empire. The Blackwell fortune had been decimated by lawsuits, divorces, and failed investments. What remained had been tied up in legal battles between various family members. Ashton inherited nothing. He didn't want anything associated with that name anyway. He changed his name legally. He became Ashton Miller, taking his mother's maiden name, severing the connection to the Blackwell legacy. He moved into a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood, took the job at the youth nonprofit, and lived quietly. His co-workers knew his history, the organization had been transparent about who they were hiring, but they judged him on his current actions, not his past. The work was hard. Ashton counseled teenagers who reminded him painfully of who he used to be, kids from wealthy families who thought their money made them invincible, who bullied and hurt others without remorse. He saw himself in their arrogance, their casual cruelty, their inability to see other people as fully human. And he dedicated himself to reaching them before they went as far as he had. Some of the kids he worked with responded. They saw in him someone who understood their world, who knew the temptations of privilege, but who'd learned the hardest way possible that actions had consequences. Others dismissed him as a hypocrite, a criminal trying to lecture them. He accepted both reactions. He knew he couldn't save everyone. He just hoped to save some. He also volunteered at schools, talking to students about bullying, about privilege, about the path he'd gone down and where it led. These talks were difficult. He had to face rooms full of teenagers, some sympathetic, some hostile, and expose his worst self. He had to describe what he'd done to Marcus in graphic detail, had to answer questions about why he'd done it, had to face their judgment. But he did it because he believed that if even one potential bully heard his story and chose differently, it was worth the shame and discomfort. Marcus heard about these talks. Someone sent him a video of one of Ashton's presentations at a high school. Marcus watched it late one night, alone in his apartment. He watched Ashton stand before a room of students and take full responsibility for his crime, watched him describe Marcus not as a victim but as a person whose life and dreams mattered, watched him answer a hostile question from a wealthy student with patience and honesty rather than defensiveness. When the video ended, Marcus sat in silence for a long time. He still felt the anger, still carried the trauma, still had nightmares about that basement and the attack. But he also felt something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of acceptance that people could change, that the system could sometimes work the way it was supposed to, that justice could mean more than just punishment. He didn't reach out to Ashton. That bridge felt too far, maybe forever. But he also didn't object when he heard that Ashton was doing good work, that kids were responding to him, that lives were potentially being changed. Marcus had moved forward with his own life. Maybe Ashton could too. Judge Evelyn Hargrove retired from the bench at 60. She'd served for 30 years, presiding over thousands of cases, but Ashton Blackwell III's trial remained the one she was most known for. In her retirement speech, she talked about that case, about how it had brought her career full circle, how it had challenged her in ways she'd never expected. She said that justice was complicated. It wasn't just about punishment or rehabilitation or deterrence. It was about trying, imperfectly, to make things right in a world that constantly pushed toward wrong. She said that her scar had taught her that some wounds never fully healed, but they could become sources of strength rather than pain. She said that breaking cycles of cruelty required both accountability and the possibility of redemption, and that finding the balance between those two things was the hardest part of wearing the robe. After her retirement, she wrote a book. It wasn't about the Blackwell case specifically, though that trial was discussed. Instead, it was about her life, her journey from a bullied scholarship student to a powerful judge, her views on how privilege distorted justice, and her belief that the system could work if people in power had the courage to apply the law equally. The book became a bestseller. Law schools assigned it. Advocacy groups quoted from it. And perhaps most importantly, it inspired a new generation of students from underprivileged backgrounds to pursue careers in law, believing that the system could change if enough people committed to changing it. Evelyn also established a scholarship fund in Marcus's name. The scholarship provided full funding for low-income students to attend elite private schools, but it also included mentorship, therapy resources, and legal support if those students faced bullying or discrimination. She didn't want other kids to go through what she and Marcus had experienced without help. She wanted to break the cycle not just through punishment but through support. 20 years after the trial, Evelyn received an unexpected letter. It was from Ashton, now in his late 30s. He wrote to tell her that he'd been working with at-risk youth for years now, that he'd helped establish a program that paired former offenders with kids heading down dangerous paths, that he'd seen real results. But he also wrote to tell her something else. He'd recently worked with a 15-year-old named Dylan, a kid from a wealthy family who'd been bullying a scholarship student at his school. The situation was escalating, and Dylan's parents were already talking about using their connections to make any problems disappear. Ashton had intervened, talking to Dylan extensively, sharing his own story, pushing Dylan to understand the path he was on. It had worked. Dylan had broken down, admitted what he'd been doing, and agreed to participate in a restorative justice process at his school. He'd apologized to the student he'd bullied, accepted consequences from the school, and committed to therapy and community service. His parents had been furious at first, wanting to protect their son from any accountability, but Ashton had convinced them that protecting Dylan from consequences would only lead to worse outcomes later. Ashton wrote that he knew one success story didn't undo what he'd done to Marcus, didn't erase his crime or make his punishment unjust. But it made him believe that his life after prison had meaning, that he was doing something worthwhile. He thanked Evelyn again for the sentence she'd imposed, for refusing to give him the easy path his father had always provided, for forcing him to face consequences that ultimately saved him from becoming an even worse person. He ended the letter by saying he'd started speaking at law schools about his case, about how the justice system had failed when he was young by never holding him accountable for earlier offenses, but had succeeded when Judge Hargrove refused to let his privilege protect him from consequences. He said that students found his perspective valuable, that it helped them understand why equal application of the law mattered, why privilege had to be actively resisted in the courtroom. Evelyn read the letter in her home office, surrounded by mementos from her career. She thought about that scared 15-year-old girl in the stairwell, bleeding and terrified, abandoned by boys who valued their status over her life. She thought about the woman she'd become, powerful and respected, but still carrying that scar as a reminder of where she came from. She thought about Marcus, who transformed his trauma into purpose. And she thought about Ashton, who needed the hardest lesson possible but had ultimately learned it. She wrote back. Her letter was brief. She told Ashton that she was glad his rehabilitation was genuine, that his work was valuable, that he was proof that the system could sometimes achieve its highest goals. But she also reminded him that his debt would never be fully paid, that Marcus would carry those scars forever, that the privilege of his second chance came with the responsibility to ensure no one else suffered the way Marcus had. She ended by saying that if he truly wanted to honor the chance he'd been given, he should continue the work, should reach as many potential bullies and victims as possible, should fight against the systems that had protected him and harmed others. That would be his real sentence, not the 15 years in prison, but the lifetime commitment to making amends through action. Ashton received the letter and kept it. He read it whenever he doubted whether his work mattered, whenever he was tempted to return to old patterns of thinking, whenever he encountered resistance from wealthy families who wanted to protect their children from consequences. It reminded him of who he'd been, who he'd become, and who he needed to continue being. The ripple effects of that trial continued to spread. Marcus eventually became a judge himself, appointed at 42 to the same courthouse where his case had been tried. His first action was to commission a plaque in the main hall, not commemorating his own case, but honoring all victims of privilege-fueled violence. It listed no names, just a simple inscription: "Justice delayed for some must not mean justice denied for all." He adopted Judge Hargrove's approach on the bench, tough but fair, refusing to let wealth or status influence his rulings. He became known, like his mentor, as a judge defense attorneys for the wealthy hated to draw. But he was also known for being genuinely interested in rehabilitation, for giving real chances to defendants who showed genuine remorse and commitment to change regardless of their background. The Blackwell family name faded from prominence. The remaining relatives sold off properties, businesses, anything connected to the legacy that had brought them so much shame. They scattered across the country, some changing their names, all trying to distance themselves from Ashton II's crimes and Ashton III's conviction. The family's fall from grace became a cautionary tale, taught in ethics classes and business schools as an example of how unchecked privilege and cruelty could destroy even the most powerful dynasties. But one Blackwell remained in the public eye. Ashton's younger sister, Charlotte, who'd been only 10 when her brother was convicted, grew up determined to undo the damage her family had caused. She became a social worker, focusing on underprivileged communities, dedicating her life to helping the kinds of people her family had looked down upon. She kept the Blackwell name deliberately, saying that running from it would be cowardice, that the name needed to be redeemed through action, not abandoned. She and Ashton maintained a relationship, though a complicated one. She'd visited him throughout his incarceration, one of the few family members who hadn't abandoned him. She'd watched his transformation with cautious hope, supporting his rehabilitation while also maintaining boundaries, never forgetting what he'd done. When he was released, she helped him adjust, found him resources, but also held him accountable, calling him out when he slipped into old patterns of thinking. Charlotte eventually wrote her own book about growing up as the sister of both a criminal and someone who genuinely changed, about the complexity of loving someone who'd done terrible things, about the difference between enabling and supporting. Her book sparked important conversations about how families should respond when their members commit serious crimes, about the balance between loyalty and accountability. The story became famous enough that it was adapted into various media. A documentary, a podcast series, eventually a limited series on a streaming platform. Each adaptation focused on different aspects: the class dynamics, the courtroom drama, the personal transformation, the larger questions about justice and privilege. Marcus and Evelyn both declined to participate directly, though they didn't try to stop the productions. Ashton participated in the documentary, subjecting himself to difficult questions, using the platform to reach more people with his message about consequences and change. Some critics argued that giving Ashton a platform was wrong, that it centered the perpetrator rather than the victim, that it risked romanticizing his redemption story. Marcus addressed these concerns when asked, saying that multiple truths could coexist. Ashton had done terrible things and deserved punishment. Ashton had served that punishment and appeared to have genuinely changed. Both things were true. Sharing his story might help prevent other kids from going down the same path. That didn't make what he'd done any less wrong, but it meant something valuable could come from something terrible. The scholarship fund Evelyn established grew substantially, funded by donations from people inspired by the story. It helped hundreds of students attend elite schools, and the support structure meant those students faced less bullying and had resources when problems arose. Several students who benefited from the scholarship went on to successful careers and continued the cycle by funding scholarships for others. One particular student, a girl named Aisha Thompson, became a documentary filmmaker. She'd attended Pembroke Academy, the same school where Marcus had been attacked, on the scholarship fund. She'd faced some bullying but nowhere near what Marcus had endured, thanks to the changed culture at the school and the support structure provided by the scholarship. She made a documentary about how elite institutions perpetuated privilege and cruelty, featuring interviews with scholarship students, wealthy students who'd participated in bullying, teachers who'd witnessed both sides, and reformed bullies including Ashton. Her documentary won awards and was shown in schools across the country, sparking discussions about class, privilege, and institutional culture. It became part of many schools' anti-bullying programs. Aisha credited Marcus, Evelyn, and yes, even the reformed Ashton for making her education and career possible. She represented the positive outcome, the cycle broken, the future changed. As the years passed and the people involved grew older, the story took on different meanings for different generations. For older people, it was a reminder of their own experiences with bullying, with privilege, with injustice. For younger people, it was a case study in how systems could both fail and succeed, how individuals could be both terrible and capable of change, how justice was more complicated than simple revenge or forgiveness. Marcus eventually married, had children, and found a happiness that had seemed impossible after the attack. His kids knew their father's story, knew what he'd survived, and they saw how he'd transformed that trauma into purpose. His older son decided to become a defense attorney, saying he wanted to represent people who'd made mistakes but deserved a chance to prove they'd changed, inspired by his father's measured response to Ashton's parole hearing. Evelyn lived to see 90, sharp and engaged until the end. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched, former law clerks, attorneys who'd appeared in her court, students who'd received her scholarships, and people she'd sentenced who genuinely turned their lives around and wanted to thank her for holding them accountable. Marcus gave the eulogy, speaking about how she'd been more than a judge to him, how she'd represented everything he believed the justice system should be. Ashton attended the funeral, sitting in the back, saying nothing to anyone. He paid his respects from a distance, understanding that his presence might be unwelcome to some, but needing to acknowledge the woman who'd changed his life by refusing to let him escape consequences. After the service, as people left, he approached Marcus. They hadn't spoken directly in years. Marcus had his arm around his wife, his children nearby. Ashton didn't try to have a conversation. He simply said, "Thank you for everything you did. For the parole hearing. For not opposing the work I do. For showing me what grace actually looks like." Marcus nodded, accepting the words without responding. There wasn't more to say. Then Ashton walked away, and that was the last time they saw each other. Charlotte continued the Family Redemption Project, establishing a foundation that funded programs for at-risk youth, particularly focusing on preventing bullying and addressing the entitlement that came with wealth. She named it the Hargrove Foundation with Evelyn's permission before she died, wanting the legacy to be associated with justice rather than the Blackwell name. The foundation funded programs in schools across the country, trained counselors to recognize and address bullying before it escalated, and provided legal resources for victims. The foundation also established a unique program where reformed bullies, vetted carefully and having completed extensive training, spoke to students about their experiences. Ashton was part of this program for years, until his own health began failing. The program was controversial. Some argued it gave too much platform to perpetrators, but the data showed it was effective. Students responded to hearing from someone who'd actually lived the consequences of their actions, who could speak to the emptiness of privilege and cruelty. As Ashton aged, he reflected often on the path his life had taken. He wrote extensively in journals, processing his past, his transformation, his ongoing work. He never published these journals, they were too personal, too raw, but he left instructions that after his death, they should be donated to a research library, available to scholars studying criminal justice, rehabilitation, and restorative justice. In one of his final entries, written when he was 57 and knew his health was declining, he wrote about the trial. He described the moment when Judge Hargrove revealed her scar, when he'd understood for the first time the full weight of what his father had done, of what he himself had done, of how cruelty echoed across generations. He wrote that in that moment his old life had ended. Not because of the prison sentence, but because he'd finally seen himself clearly, stripped of all the justifications and excuses, and he'd been horrified. He wrote about Marcus, about the courage it took to face him in that courtroom, to give that impact statement, to later take a measured position on parole. He wrote that he'd spent 25 years trying to become someone worthy of that mercy, and he still wasn't sure he'd succeeded. He wrote that he hoped, if nothing else, his work had prevented even one kid from going down the path he'd walked, from causing the kind of pain he'd caused. If so, maybe his life after prison had meant something. Ashton died at 58, complications from pneumonia. His funeral was small, attended by Charlotte, a few colleagues from the youth program, and surprisingly, Judge Marcus Chen. Marcus came because he believed that Ashton had genuinely changed, and that deserved acknowledgement. He didn't speak at the service, didn't claim to have forgiven, but his presence said something important about his belief in the possibility of redemption. In the obituary Charlotte wrote, she was honest about who her brother had been and what he'd done. She detailed the crime, the sentence, but also the decades of work afterward. She said that Ashton's story was complicated, that he was both the worst thing he'd ever done and everything he'd done to make amends, and that neither could be understood without the other. The obituary sparked discussions, with some praising her honesty and others criticizing any positive portrayal of a man who'd committed such violence. But for those who'd worked with Ashton, who'd seen the kids he'd reached, who'd witnessed the programs he'd helped build, his passing represented the loss of someone genuinely dedicated to preventing others from making his mistakes. The youth organization held a memorial where dozens of people spoke about how Ashton had impacted them, how his willingness to be vulnerable about his past had reached them when nothing else had. One young man, now 25, spoke about meeting Ashton when he was 15 and on the verge of seriously hurting another student. He talked about how Ashton had been the first person to talk to him not as a problem to be managed but as someone heading toward a cliff who could still change direction. That conversation had changed his life. He'd gone on to college, become a teacher, and now worked with at-risk students himself, continuing the work Ashton had started. The ripple effects continued, generation after generation. Students who'd been impacted by the scholarship fund, by anti-bullying programs, by Ashton's talks, by the cultural changes at elite schools, grew up and sent their own kids to school with different values. They taught their children that privilege was a responsibility, not a right, that cruelty was never acceptable regardless of status, that everyone deserved dignity and respect. Pembroke Academy, where the original attack occurred, underwent major reforms. The school administration implemented comprehensive anti-bullying policies, hired counselors specifically to support scholarship students, created anonymous reporting systems, and most importantly, changed the culture from one that tolerated wealthy students' cruelty to one that actively opposed it. The school established an annual lecture series on ethics, privilege, and justice, inviting speakers to challenge students' assumptions about wealth and worth. At one of these lectures, 10 years after Ashton's death, Judge Marcus Chen spoke to the student body. He was 72 now, recently retired from the bench, and he'd finally agreed to return to the school where he'd nearly died. He stood in the same auditorium where he'd once been an invisible scholarship student and spoke to a room full of teenagers about what happened to him, about the trial, about the complicated legacy of the Blackwell case. He talked about Judge Hargrove's courage in revealing her past, about how trauma could become fuel for justice rather than revenge. He talked about Ashton's genuine transformation, while emphasizing that it didn't erase the crime, didn't make the years of suffering disappear. He talked about his own journey, how he'd chosen to build something meaningful from something terrible, how he'd dedicated his life to ensuring the system worked better for people who looked like him, who came from where he came from. But mostly he talked about cycles. How cruelty was passed down through generations when left unchecked, how privilege distorted people's moral compasses, how systems protected the powerful unless people in those systems actively chose justice over convenience. He talked about how cycles could be broken through accountability, through consequences, through institutions choosing to do better, through individuals refusing to pass cruelty forward. The students listened with an intensity that surprised the faculty. This wasn't an abstract lesson about ethics from a textbook. This was real. It had happened in their school to someone who'd sat in their classrooms, walked their halls, studied in their library. The basement where it happened was now a memorial space, converted after the trial, displaying information about bullying prevention and resources for students who felt unsafe or targeted. After Marcus's lecture, a student approached him during the reception. The kid was 14, clearly nervous, and he admitted that he'd been bullying a scholarship student, nothing physical, just words and social exclusion, but he'd been doing it. Hearing Marcus's story, understanding what bullying could escalate to had shaken him. He wanted to know what he should do, how he could make it right. Marcus didn't give easy answers. He said making it right would be hard, uncomfortable, and incomplete. The student would need to genuinely apologize, accept whatever consequences came from the school, work to understand why he'd felt the need to put someone else down, and commit to changing his behavior permanently. He said it would mean losing friends who wouldn't understand why he'd stopped participating in the cruelty. He said the student he'd bullied might never forgive him, and he'd have to accept that. But Marcus also said that having the courage to recognize the harm and choose differently was important. That stopping the cycle now, before it escalated, was valuable. That the student had the chance to be better than Ashton Blackwell had been, to choose accountability before the law forced it on him. And that would make all the difference. The student took Marcus's words seriously. He reported his own behavior to the school administration, apologized to the student he'd bullied, accepted suspension and mandatory counseling, and faced the social consequences of breaking ranks with his wealthy peer group. It was hard, exactly as Marcus had said it would be. But the student did it, and in doing so, broke a cycle before it could continue. Stories like this happened across the country, in schools that implemented programs inspired by the Blackwell case, in courtrooms where judges remembered Evelyn Hargrove's example, in communities where people refused to look away from bullying and privilege. Not every story had a perfect ending. Not every bully changed. Not every victim received justice. But more did than before, and that mattered. The cultural impact of the Blackwell case extended beyond schools. Corporations began examining their own cultures of privilege and entitlement, implementing ethics training and reporting systems. Law schools used the case to teach about judicial ethics, discretion in sentencing, and the relationship between privilege and crime. Therapy programs for affluent teens incorporated lessons about entitlement and empathy. Parents groups discussed how to raise wealthy children without instilling the arrogance that had defined the Blackwell family. Charlotte Blackwell's foundation expanded internationally, bringing anti-bullying and privilege awareness programs to elite schools in multiple countries. She'd become a leading voice on these issues, frequently invited to speak at conferences, universities, and policy forums. She always began by acknowledging her own privilege, the fact that she'd grown up with every advantage while benefiting from a system that harmed others, and her family's role in perpetuating that harm. She also spoke about the complexity of loving someone who'd done terrible things, about how she'd had to hold both truths, that Ashton had nearly murdered someone and that he'd genuinely transformed. She said that society needed to get better at holding this complexity, at acknowledging that people could be more than their worst acts without minimizing those acts, at believing in rehabilitation while still demanding accountability. Her TED Talk on the subject went viral, viewed millions of times, sparking conversations about privilege, justice, and redemption across social media platforms. Some people praised her honesty and nuance. Others criticized her for defending her brother, for trying to rehab the Blackwell name, for centering perpetrators in discussions that should focus on victims. Charlotte addressed the criticism directly in follow-up interviews, saying she understood it, that victims' voices should always be prioritized, but that preventing future victims required understanding how perpetrators were created and how they could be stopped. The debates continued, healthy and necessary, forcing people to grapple with difficult questions that had no easy answers. How should society balance punishment and rehabilitation? When should someone's past define them forever, and when should transformation be acknowledged? How could systems protect victims while still offering pathways for offenders to change? What responsibility did privileged families have to address the harm their privilege caused? These questions became more urgent as economic inequality grew, as the gap between wealthy and poor students widened, as cases similar to Marcus and Ashton's continued happening across the country. The Blackwell case became a reference point, a reminder that ignoring these issues, protecting privileged kids from consequences, only ensured the cycle continued. 3 decades after the trial, a researcher at Columbia University completed a comprehensive study on the long-term impacts of the Blackwell case. The study examined changes in elite school cultures, shifts in how courts sentenced privileged defendants, the effectiveness of anti-bullying programs, and the outcomes for everyone involved in the original case. The findings were remarkable. Schools that implemented comprehensive reforms showed significant decreases in bullying incidents, particularly targeting based on economic status. Courts that adopted more consistent sentencing standards, refusing to give lighter sentences based on privilege, saw slightly lower recidivism rates among wealthy offenders. Programs where reformed offenders spoke to at-risk kids showed measurable impacts on behavior change. But the study also showed the limits. Bullying hadn't disappeared. Privilege still distorted justice in many cases. Wealthy defendants still often received lighter sentences than poor defendants for similar crimes. Cultural change was slow, uneven, and required constant effort to maintain. The Blackwell case had sparked important conversations and real reforms, but it hadn't fixed the underlying problems. Marcus, reading the study at age 75, wasn't discouraged by this. He'd never expected one case to change everything. What mattered was that things were better than they'd been, that some kids were safer than they would have been, that some accountability existed where there'd been none. Progress was incremental, frustrating, and essential. He thought about his younger self, lying in that basement, broken and bleeding, wondering if he'd survive, wondering if anyone would care, wondering if justice existed for people like him. That kid couldn't have imagined that the attack would lead to a trial that changed judicial approaches to privilege, that sparked nationwide conversations, that inspired reforms and programs that helped countless students. It didn't make what happened to him okay. The trauma still lived in his body, the scars still ached, the nightmares still occasionally came. But it meant that something meaningful had come from something terrible, that his suffering hadn't been meaningless, that the system had worked, imperfectly but genuinely, to hold his attacker accountable and to prevent others from experiencing what he had. Judge Evelyn Hargrove would have been proud to see the impact her decision had catalyzed. Her willingness to be vulnerable, to reveal her own past trauma in that courtroom, had done something powerful. It had humanized the judge, shown that justice wasn't abstract but personal, that the people administering it carried their own scars and used them to inform their understanding of what justice required. Her revelation had also done something important for other victims of privilege-fueled violence. It showed them that their trauma didn't have to define them, that they could build powerful lives, that they could use their experiences to protect others. Dozens of people had reached out to her over the years, sharing their own stories of bullying and assault by privileged classmates, thanking her for making them feel less alone, for showing that justice was possible even if it came decades later in unexpected ways. The scar on her arm had become symbolic, featured in articles and documentaries about the case. Some critics argued she'd been wrong to reveal it, that she'd compromised her judicial impartiality by bringing her personal history into the sentencing. But legal scholars generally concluded that her revelation had come after the verdict, when she had discretion in sentencing, and that her decision was within legal bounds. The sentence itself was justified by the severity of Ashton's crime and the evidence, not by her personal history, though that history had perhaps given her the moral clarity to resist pressure to be lenient. In the end, the Blackwell case became more than just a trial. It became a cultural touchstone, a teaching tool, a reminder of what justice could look like when people in power refused to let privilege protect the guilty. It was studied in law schools, discussed in ethics classes, referenced in policy debates, and remembered by everyone who'd followed it. The story had villains and victims, yes, but it also had complexity. It showed that terrible people could change, though change required genuine accountability and consequences first. It showed that victims could survive and build meaningful lives, though the trauma never fully disappeared. It showed that the justice system could work, when judges had courage, when juries took their responsibility seriously, when society demanded accountability regardless of wealth or status. Most importantly, it showed that cycles could be broken. The cycle of Blackwell cruelty, passing from Ashton II to Ashton III, had been broken by consequences, by prison, by forced confrontation with the harm caused. The cycle of victims suffering silently without justice, which had defined Evelyn's experience, had been broken by her rise to power and her refusal to let history repeat itself. The cycle of elite schools protecting wealthy bullies had been broken by reforms, policies, and cultural changes that centered student safety over donor comfort. These broken cycles represented hope. Not easy hope, not naive hope, but the hard-won understanding that change was possible if people committed to it, if institutions chose justice over convenience, if society refused to accept that wealth equaled immunity. As the people involved in the original case aged and passed away, as new generations learned the story without having lived through it, the core lessons remained. Privilege was dangerous when unchecked. Cruelty compounded across generations when unpunished. Justice required courage from those in power to resist pressure and do what was right. And perhaps most importantly, people could change, but only if they were first held accountable for their actions. The basement at Pembroke Academy where Marcus was attacked remained a memorial space. Students visited it regularly, reading the information about bullying prevention, reflecting on the violence that had occurred there, committing to being better. The space wasn't morbid or exploitative. It was honest, acknowledging what happened, honoring Marcus's survival, and challenging every student who entered to think about what kind of person they wanted to be. On the wall hung a quote from Marcus, given during an interview decades after the attack. "Justice isn't about revenge or forgiveness. It's about breaking cycles so the next person doesn't suffer what you did. It's about making sure that power and privilege can't protect people from the consequences of their cruelty. It's about building a world where everyone matters, regardless of how much money they have or where they come from." That's what Judge Hargrove gave me. Not revenge but justice. And that changed everything. Beside it hung a quote from Judge Hargrove from her retirement speech. "The scar on my arm is a reminder of what happens when we let privilege protect cruelty. But it's also a reminder that we can survive, we can rise, and we can use our power to ensure that others don't suffer as we did." That's what wearing this robe means. It means standing between the powerful and the vulnerable, and choosing the vulnerable every time, no matter what pressure comes, no matter what it costs. That's justice. And finally, added after his death, a quote from Ashton Miller from his private journals. "I cannot undo what I did. I cannot give Marcus back the months in the hospital, the years of trauma, the sense of safety I stole from him. All I can do is ensure that my transformation, my work, my commitment prevents even one other person from suffering what he suffered. If I can break the cycle that created me, if I can stop another privileged kid from becoming what I was, then maybe my life after prison will mean something. Maybe not redemption, I don't know if I deserve that. But meaning, purpose, a reason that I survived the consequences I deserved." These three quotes represented the journey from victim to judge to reform defender, each person using their experience to break cycles, to prevent harm, to build something better from something terrible. They represented different facets of justice: the protection of victims, the courage to hold perpetrators accountable, and the difficult work of genuine transformation. Students who read these quotes were challenged to think about their own choices. Would they use their privilege to harm or to help? Would they stand up when they saw bullying or look away? Would they demand accountability when their peers did wrong or protect them because of shared status? Would they perpetuate cycles or break them? These weren't abstract questions. Every day in schools across the country, students faced moments where they could choose cruelty or kindness, where they could exercise their privilege to harm or to protect, where they could perpetuate systems of inequality or challenge them. The Blackwell case, still taught and discussed decades later, reminded them that these choices mattered, that they compounded over time, that they created futures none of them could fully foresee. And so the story continued, not as something finished and resolved, but as something living, evolving, teaching new lessons to new generations. The original trial had ended decades ago, but its impact rippled forward, touching lives, shaping policies, changing cultures, breaking cycles. Marcus Chen in his final years reflected on all of this. He'd lived a full life, meaningful and purposeful, despite the trauma that had shaped so much of it. He'd helped countless people, changed systems, served justice faithfully. His children and grandchildren carried forward his values, working in fields that helped others, committed to breaking cycles of inequality and violence. When he was asked, usually by young lawyers or students, whether he ever regretted what happened, whether he wished that night in the basement had never occurred, his answer was complex. Of course he wished he hadn't been attacked, hadn't nearly died, hadn't carried decades of trauma. That went without saying. But he also couldn't imagine his life without what followed, the purpose it gave him, the people he'd helped, the changes he'd contributed to. He'd been given a choice in how to respond to injustice and injustice, and he'd chosen to fight for a better system. That choice had defined him in ways both painful and profound. He didn't romanticize what happened. He didn't claim that trauma made people stronger or that suffering was necessary for growth. Those were comfortable lies people told to make sense of senseless violence. What he did believe was that people could choose how they carried their scars, whether they let them fester into bitterness or transformed them into fuel for change. He'd chosen the latter not because it was easy or because it healed all wounds, but because it was the only way forward that felt meaningful. In his last interview, given at age 83 just months before his death, Marcus was asked what he wanted people to remember about the Blackwell case. He was quiet for a long time, his aged hands folded in his lap, his eyes distant as he traveled back through decades of memory. Finally, he said that he wanted people to remember it was about more than one trial, more than one victim and one perpetrator. It was about systems, about how privilege flowed through generations, about how institutions chose who to protect and who to abandon. It was about the courage it took to disrupt those systems, to demand that everyone face consequences equally, to refuse to let money and status determine justice. But he also said he wanted people to remember that it was about individuals making choices. Judge Hargrove choosing to reveal her past, to risk criticism and controversy to make a point about cycles of cruelty. The jury members choosing to convict despite the Blackwell name and power. The students who testified despite social pressure to stay silent. His own mother, who'd worked herself to exhaustion to give him opportunities, who'd sat through that trial with dignity even as the defense tried to paint her as inadequate. All of these choices mattered. And yes, he said Ashton's choice to genuinely change mattered too. It didn't erase the crime, didn't mean forgiveness was required or that the severe sentence was unjust. But it meant that the system's highest goal, rehabilitation alongside accountability, was possible. It meant that even someone raised with every advantage, every excuse, every opportunity to remain entitled and cruel, could choose differently if confronted with real consequences. Marcus said that was what he wanted the case to represent. Not simple revenge, not easy forgiveness, but the hard, complex work of justice. The work of holding people accountable while still believing in the possibility of change. The work of supporting victims while not requiring them to forgive. The work of changing systems while acknowledging that individual choices within those systems still mattered. He ended the interview by saying that if young people learned anything from his story, he hoped it was this, that they had more power than they realized. Power to choose kindness over cruelty, to stand up when they witnessed injustice, to refuse to perpetuate cycles even when it was easier to go along. Power to use their privilege, whatever form it took, to protect rather than harm. Power to build the world they wanted to live in, one choice at a time. Those were his final public words about the case. He died 3 months later, peacefully, surrounded by family. His funeral was enormous, attended by hundreds of people whose lives he'd touched. Former defendants he'd given fair chances to, lawyers he'd mentored, students who'd received scholarships in his name, colleagues from his years on the bench, family members spanning 3 generations. Charlotte Blackwell attended, now in her 70s herself, still running the foundation that bore Judge Hargrove's name. She sat quietly in the back, paying respects to the man her brother had nearly killed, the man whose measured response to Ashton's parole had given her brother a chance at redemption. After the service, she approached Marcus's oldest son, who'd become a defense attorney as planned. She told him that his father had been one of the most remarkable people she'd ever known, that his ability to carry both trauma and grace, to demand accountability while still believing in change, had shaped her own life's work. She said that Ashton had died grateful for Marcus's measured response, that it had meant more to him than any forgiveness would have. She offered to continue supporting the scholarships and programs Marcus had championed, to ensure his legacy continued. Marcus's son accepted, and they formed a partnership that strengthened both of their foundations. Together, they funded programs across the country, continuing the work of breaking cycles, of addressing privilege and entitlement, of supporting victims while also believing in the possibility of rehabilitation for those who genuinely committed to change. The programs they created were innovative, bringing together unlikely partners. Former victims and reformed offenders co-led workshops on restorative justice. Wealthy families and working-class families participated in dialogues about privilege and opportunity. Students from elite schools and public schools collaborated on anti-bullying initiatives. The work was difficult, often uncomfortable, sometimes controversial, but it was effective. One program in particular gained attention. It brought together teens who'd been bullied with teens who'd been bullies, after both had gone through extensive preparation and counseling. The sessions were facilitated by trained therapists and focused on understanding, not forgiveness. Victims had space to express the impact of what they'd experienced. Bullies had to sit with the consequences of their actions, without defending or explaining them away. The program was careful and ethical, never forcing victims to participate, never suggesting that they owed their bullies anything, always prioritizing their well-being. But for those who chose to participate, the results were powerful. Victims reported feeling heard and validated in ways that traditional justice processes often didn't provide. Bullies confronted the humanity of the people they'd harmed, which proved more effective at changing behavior than any punishment alone. Critics worried the program was too soft on bullies, that it centered their feelings and growth over victims' trauma. The program coordinators took these concerns seriously, constantly adjusting protocols to ensure victims weren't being asked to do emotional labor for their bullies' benefit. They emphasized that the program was supplementary, not a replacement for school discipline or legal consequences where applicable. It was one tool among many in the complex work of addressing bullying and privilege. The program's existence sparked broader conversations about restorative justice, about what victims needed beyond punishment of offenders, about how to prevent bullying rather than just responding to it after the fact. Schools across the country experimented with different approaches, learning from each other's successes and failures, slowly building a body of knowledge about what actually worked to create safer, more equitable environments. None of this would have happened without the Blackwell case. That trial, that moment when Judge Hargrove revealed her scar and connected past to present, had catalyzed a movement. It had made visible the ways that privilege protected cruelty, had shown that accountability was possible even for the wealthy and powerful, had demonstrated that trauma could be transformed into purpose. Pembroke Academy, where the original attack occurred, became a leader in this work. The school that had once tolerated and even enabled bullying of scholarship students transformed into an institution that actively worked to dismantle privilege and create equity. The changes were comprehensive, addressing admissions policies, financial aid, curriculum, school culture, support systems, and disciplinary procedures. The school established a program where scholarship students and wealthy students were paired as partners rather than segregated by economic status. They shared classes, worked on projects together, participated in activities that built genuine relationships across class divides. The program didn't eliminate all problems, privilege didn't disappear overnight, but it created understanding and empathy that made casual cruelty less likely. The school also implemented a truth and reconciliation process, where alumni could come forward to share their experiences of bullying, either as victims or as perpetrators. The process was voluntary and confidential, but dozens of former students participated. Their testimonies revealed patterns that went back decades, long before Marcus's attack, showing how the school's culture had consistently protected wealthy bullies and marginalized scholarship students. These revelations led to a formal apology from the school's administration and board of trustees. They acknowledged that the institution had failed in its duty to protect all students, that it had prioritized donors and wealthy families over the well-being of less privileged students, that this had allowed a culture of cruelty to flourish. They committed to ongoing reforms, to transparency, to accountability. Some alumni were angry that the apology came so late, decades after they'd suffered. Others appreciated the acknowledgement, even if it couldn't undo the past. The process was messy and imperfect, but it was necessary. It showed that institutions could take responsibility for their failures, could commit to change, could work to ensure that future students didn't experience what past students had. Other elite schools watched Pembroke's transformation and some began implementing similar reforms. Not all, certainly. Many schools continued prioritizing wealthy donors over student well-being, continued looking away from bullying, continued perpetuating the systems that protected privilege. But enough changed that a shift became visible. Elite education began, slowly and incompletely, to reckon with its role in perpetuating inequality and cruelty. The changes rippled beyond schools into other institutions. Corporations began examining their own cultures, recognizing that workplace bullying often followed similar patterns to school bullying, with powerful, privileged individuals tormenting less powerful colleagues without consequences. Tech companies, law firms, financial institutions, all faced reckonings about toxic cultures that protected abusive leaders because they generated revenue or had important connections. Some companies implemented programs inspired by the Blackwell case's lessons. They created better reporting systems for harassment and abuse, they trained managers to recognize and address privilege-based cruelty, they established consequences that applied equally regardless of how valuable someone was to the bottom line. Not every company made genuine changes, many reforms were superficial, but enough shifted that workplace culture began evolving. The legal system also felt the impact. Judges across the country, inspired by Evelyn Hargrove's example, began pushing back against the tendency to give lighter sentences to wealthy defendants. They wrote opinions explicitly addressing how privilege couldn't be a factor in sentencing, how coming from a good family or having opportunities couldn't mitigate serious crimes. The pushback wasn't universal. Plenty of judges still gave lighter sentences to privileged defendants, still accepted arguments about bright futures that would be ruined by harsh punishment, still seemed to value the lives and well-being of wealthy defendants over their victims. But Evelyn's approach became a model, a reference point, proof that a judge could resist pressure from wealth and power without being overturned on appeal. Law schools began teaching the Blackwell case as an example of judicial courage and ethical sentencing. Students analyzed Evelyn's decision, debating whether she should have recused herself, whether her personal history created bias, whether her revelation after sentencing was appropriate. The debates were valuable, forcing future lawyers and judges to grapple with complex questions about impartiality, discretion, and the role of lived experience in judicial decision-making. Most legal scholars concluded that Evelyn had handled everything correctly. She presided over the trial with impartiality, making rulings based on law and evidence. The verdict came from the jury, not from her. Her sentencing decision was within legal guidelines and justified by the severity of the crime. Her revelation about her past came after all legal decisions were made and served an educational purpose, illustrating why accountability mattered and why privilege couldn't protect people from consequences. But some scholars disagreed, arguing that Evelyn's personal history inevitably influenced her decisions, even unconsciously, and that she should have recused herself despite the difficulty of finding another judge willing to stand up to the Blackwell family's power. These dissenting views were important too, maintaining pressure on the system to take judicial bias seriously, even when judges were perceived as heroes. The debates continued, healthy and necessary, ensuring that the Blackwell case remained a living example rather than a settled story. Each generation of law students brought fresh perspectives, asked new questions, challenged previous assumptions. The case remained relevant because the issues it raised remained relevant: privilege, accountability, the possibility of change, the meaning of justice. As decades passed and the case receded further into history, it took on different meanings. For some, it was a true crime story, dramatic and compelling. For others, it was a case study in class dynamics and institutional power. For still others, it was a personal inspiration, proof that trauma survivors could build powerful lives and that justice was possible even when the odds seemed impossible. The case also became a cautionary tale for wealthy families. The Blackwell name, once synonymous with power and prestige, became associated with cruelty and downfall. Parents in elite circles used the story to talk to their children about privilege, about how money didn't make you better than anyone else, about how actions had consequences regardless of your family name. Not all these conversations were effective. Some wealthy parents paid lip service to the lessons while still transmitting entitlement to their children through their behavior and expectations. But some genuinely wrestled with how to raise kids who had every advantage without raising kids who believed they were entitled to harm others without consequences. The Blackwell case gave them a framework, a stark example of what happened when privilege went unchecked. Charlotte Blackwell's children grew up with the weight of their family history. They knew what their grandfather had done to Evelyn, what their uncle had done to Marcus, how their family name had become shorthand for entitled cruelty. Charlotte was honest with them, never sugarcoating or making excuses, but also teaching them that they could define themselves differently, that they could use their privilege to help rather than harm. Both of Charlotte's children went into public service. One became a prosecutor focusing on cases involving abuse of power by wealthy defendants. The other became a teacher in an underfunded public school, deliberately choosing to work with students who had few advantages. They kept the Blackwell name like their mother, believing that running from it would be cowardice, that it needed to be redeemed through action. Their careers occasionally brought them uncomfortable attention. Journalists sometimes sought them out for articles about the Blackwell legacy, wanting quotes about growing up in that shadow. They generally declined, believing their work should speak for itself rather than being filtered through the family drama. But their choices spoke volumes about the possibility of breaking cycles, of choosing differently than previous generations. By the time a century had passed since Evelyn Hargrove was pushed down that stairwell, since Ashton Blackwell II and his friends had left her bleeding while they decided whether to help, the world had changed in ways both dramatic and subtle. Economic inequality had worsened in many ways, making the class dynamics of the Blackwell case even more relevant. But awareness of how privilege operated, how it protected cruelty, how it needed to be actively resisted, had grown significantly. The Blackwell case hadn't single-handedly created this awareness, of course. It was one story among many, one catalyst among numerous forces pushing for change. But it had mattered. It had reached people, changed minds, sparked reforms, broken cycles. Thousands of students had attended schools that were safer because of programs inspired by the case. Hundreds of defendants had received fairer sentences because judges remembered Evelyn Hargrove's example. Dozens of potential bullies had changed course after hearing Ashton Miller's story. These impacts were difficult to quantify precisely, hard to separate from other factors, impossible to prove definitively. But they were real. Ask the scholarship student who'd reported bullying and actually been taken seriously, protected rather than dismissed, because their school had policies in place. Ask the judge who'd resisted pressure to give a light sentence to a wealthy defendant, drawing strength from Evelyn's example. Ask the teenager who'd chosen to stop bullying after a reformed bully spoke at their school about consequences and regret. For these individuals, the Blackwell case wasn't abstract history. It was a direct influence on their lives, a reason they'd been protected or had chosen differently or had found courage to do the right thing. Multiply these individual stories by thousands, and the case's impact became clear. Not a complete transformation of society, not a perfect solution to privilege and cruelty, but real, meaningful change. The final living connection to the original case was Marcus Chen's youngest granddaughter, Sophia. She was born 3 years before Marcus died, too young to remember him well, but she grew up surrounded by his legacy. Her family told her stories about her great-grandfather, about what he'd survived, about the purpose he'd built from trauma, about his commitment to justice. When Sophia was 15, the same age Marcus had been when he was attacked, her family took her to Pembroke Academy. The school maintained the memorial space in the basement, though it had been updated over the years as new educational approaches to bullying prevention emerged. Sophia stood in that space, reading the information about what happened, looking at her great-grandfather's photo from that time, trying to imagine what he'd experienced. She felt anger, grief, and pride in equal measure. Anger that anyone had hurt him, grief for the pain he'd carried, pride in what he'd built despite it all. Standing there, she made a private commitment to continue his work, to be someone who protected the vulnerable, who stood up to privilege and cruelty, who helped break cycles. She went on to study social psychology, fascinated by the question of why people bullied, why privilege seemed to enable cruelty, how to create environments where empathy flourished instead. Her doctoral research focused specifically on bullying in elite schools, using the Blackwell case as a foundational example. She interviewed hundreds of students, teachers, and administrators from elite schools across the country, analyzing what interventions actually worked to prevent bullying and create more equitable school cultures. Her research confirmed what the decades since the Blackwell case had suggested. Real change required multiple interventions at every level: admissions policies that didn't favor wealth, financial aid that allowed economic diversity, curriculum that addressed privilege and power, explicit anti-bullying policies with real consequences, support systems for vulnerable students, and cultural shifts that challenged rather than celebrated entitlement. No single reform was sufficient. Schools that implemented 1 or 2 changes without addressing the broader culture saw minimal impact. But schools that committed to comprehensive transformation, that made equity and safety central to their mission, showed significant reductions in bullying and improvements in student well-being across socioeconomic lines. Sophia's research became influential in educational policy circles. School boards and administrators used her findings to design better interventions. Teacher training programs incorporated her work. Parents' organizations discussed her recommendations for how to raise kids who understood their privilege without being entitled by it. She eventually wrote a book, published exactly 100 years after the original trial. The book was part historical analysis of the Blackwell case, part research summary, part memoir about growing up with this legacy. She titled it Breaking Cycles: A Century of Justice, Trauma, and Change. The book became a bestseller, reaching audiences beyond academia and education policy. People who'd never heard of the Blackwell case learned the story and found it resonating with their own experiences. Victims of bullying saw themselves in Marcus's journey. People grappling with privilege recognized their own struggles to raise children differently. Those interested in justice found inspiration in Evelyn Hargrove's courage and in the complex question of whether and how people like Ashton could genuinely change. Reviews of the book were largely positive, praising Sophia's ability to hold multiple truths simultaneously: that Marcus's trauma was real and lasting, that the severe sentence was justified, that Ashton's transformation was genuine, that victims didn't owe forgiveness, that believing in rehabilitation was important, that preventing future harm mattered more than any individual story. Critics argued she was too sympathetic to Ashton, that giving any positive attention to a violent offender was wrong regardless of what came after. Sophia addressed these criticisms seriously, acknowledging the tension, never claiming to have perfect answers. The book's publication sparked renewed interest in the case. News articles revisited the story, now with a century of perspective. Documentaries were updated with Sophia's research and insights. Schools that had drifted from their initial reforms recommitted to the work. The case felt relevant again, perhaps even more relevant than before, as issues of inequality and privilege remained stubbornly persistent despite decades of awareness and effort. Sophia became a sought-after speaker, invited to conferences, schools, and community events. She always began her talks by acknowledging her great-grandfather, by honoring what he'd survived and what he'd built. She'd say that she stood on his shoulders, that everything she understood about justice and trauma and change came from his example and from the examples of Judge Hargrove, Charlotte Blackwell, and yes, even Ashton Miller. She'd tell the full story, not sanitizing any of it, not softening the violence or the privilege or the complexity. She'd talk about how her great-grandfather had nearly died in a basement because a wealthy teenager thought his life didn't matter, about how that teenager's father had done something similar decades earlier without consequences, about how Judge Hargrove had waited 28 years for a chance to break that cycle. But she'd also talk about what came after. About how accountability, real accountability with real consequences, had enabled change. About how Ashton Blackwell III, who seemed irredeemable, had spent 25 years proving otherwise. About how her great-grandfather had chosen purpose over bitterness. About how Judge Hargrove had transformed her trauma into a commitment to justice. About how Charlotte Blackwell had rejected her family's legacy and built something different. And most importantly, she'd talk about how all of this meant that cycles could be broken, that change was possible, that every person in every audience had the power to choose. To choose accountability over protection of privilege. To choose empathy over cruelty. To choose justice over convenience. To choose the hard work of building a better world over the easy comfort of accepting how things were. Her audiences were diverse. Wealthy parents anxious about raising good kids, students navigating elite schools, teachers struggling with bullying, judges grappling with sentencing disparities, activists working for justice reform. They all found something in the story, some insight or inspiration or challenge that resonated with their particular situation. One talk in particular became famous. Sophia was speaking at Pembroke Academy, the school where her great-grandfather had been attacked 102 years earlier. She stood in the memorial space in the basement, where they'd installed theater-style seating for special events, and she spoke to a packed audience of current students, alumni spanning multiple generations, faculty, and community members. She told the story as she always did, honestly and completely. But when she reached the end, instead of her usual closing about the power of choice, she did something different. She invited anyone in the audience who'd been affected by bullying either as victim or perpetrator, to stand and be recognized. Not to share their stories unless they wanted to, just to stand to make visible how many people carried these experiences. Slowly people stood. A current student who'd been bullied for being on financial aid. An alumnus from the 1980s who'd been tormented for being gay. A teacher who'd been bullied by wealthy parents when she tried to discipline their child. And then, unexpectedly, a current senior stood, voice shaking, and admitted that he'd been bullying a younger student, that hearing this story had made him realize he needed to stop, that he wanted to make it right. More people stood. Some were victims, some were former bullies who'd changed, some were bystanders who'd failed to intervene and regretted it. Within minutes, more than half the audience was standing. The visual impact was powerful, undeniable. Bullying wasn't rare or exceptional. It was common, endemic, woven through the fabric of elite institutions and society at large. Sophia looked at all the standing people and said that this was why the work mattered, why the Blackwell case still resonated a century later. Because the problems it exposed hadn't disappeared. Privilege still protected cruelty. Institutions still looked away. Victims still suffered in silence. But awareness had grown, tools had been developed, paths to justice had been forged. The work of breaking cycles continued, and everyone in this room was part of it. She asked everyone to sit, then posed a question. 100 years from now, when people looked back at this moment, what would they see? Would they see continued progress, more cycles broken, more justice achieved? Or would they see the same patterns repeating, the same protection of privilege, the same victims suffering without accountability? The answer, she said, depended on the choices everyone in this room made, on whether they committed to the hard work of change or accepted the easy comfort of how things were. The talk ended in silence, people sitting with the weight of that question. Then, slowly they began to stand and applaud, not because Sophia had given them easy answers or comfortable reassurances, but because she'd challenged them, asked them to be part of something larger than themselves, invited them into the ongoing work of justice. In the days after that talk, something shifted at Pembroke Academy. Students organized a new anti-bullying initiative led entirely by peers. The senior who'd admitted to bullying worked with the student he'd targeted, facilitated by school counselors, in a restorative process that addressed the harm and created accountability. Faculty proposed new policies that would make reporting bullying easier and consequences more consistent. Alumni increased donations to the scholarship fund, committing to ensuring economic diversity. Were these changes perfect? No. Did they solve all problems? Of course not. But they mattered. They represented people choosing to be part of breaking cycles rather than perpetuating them. They proved that Sophia's great-grandfather's suffering, Judge Hargrove's courage, and even Ashton Miller's painful transformation hadn't been meaningless. They'd created something lasting, a legacy that continued inspiring action. And so the story of rich teen bully Ashton Blackwell III and Judge Evelyn Hargrove and scholarship student Marcus Chen lived on, not as ancient history but as living memory, continuing to teach, to challenge, to inspire. The courtroom twist that revealed their shared dark past had catalyzed a century of change, imperfect but real, ongoing but meaningful. The cycles weren't fully broken. Privilege still existed, cruelty still happened, justice still fell short too often. But the Blackwell case stood as proof that cycles could be disrupted, that accountability was possible, that people could change, that trauma survivors could build powerful lives, that institutions could reform, that society could choose justice over convenience. A century after Judge Hargrove showed her scar, after she connected past to present, after she demanded accountability regardless of privilege or power, her legacy endured. Not in perfect solutions or complete transformations, but in ongoing commitment to the work, in thousands of individual choices to choose differently, to stand up, to protect the vulnerable, to break the cycles. And that, ultimately, was the real karma. Not simple revenge, not easy redemption, but the hard, complex, essential work of justice. The work that Marcus Chen, Evelyn Hargrove, Charlotte Blackwell, Ashton Miller, and countless others had dedicated their lives to. The work that Sophia Chen and her generation now carried forward. The work that would never be finished, but that mattered more than anything else. Because privilege would always try to protect cruelty. Power would always try to escape consequences. And justice would always require people brave enough to resist, to demand accountability, to break cycles, to choose the hard right over the easy wrong. The scar on Judge Hargrove's hand, revealed in that courtroom a century ago, had become a symbol of all of this. Of trauma survived, of justice demanded, of cycles broken. It reminded everyone who heard the story that wounds could become sources of strength, that victims could become powerful, that the arc of justice was long but it bent toward accountability when people had the courage to pull it in that direction. And in the end that was enough. Not perfect but enough. Not complete but meaningful. Not the end of the story but a chapter that mattered, that changed things, that gave hope that the next chapter could be even better. The work continued. The cycles kept breaking, slowly, imperfectly but genuinely. And the legacy of that courtroom moment, when a judge showed her scar and revealed how karma had finally caught up with the Blackwell family's cruelty, lived on in every person who chose justice, who protected the vulnerable, who held the powerful accountable, who believed that everyone mattered regardless of money or status. That was the real twist, the one that kept unfolding across generations. Not just that karma had brought Ashton Blackwell III to Judge Evelyn Hargrove's courtroom, but that their confrontation had sparked something larger, something ongoing, something that transformed individual trauma into collective purpose, personal justice into systemic change. And somewhere, in classrooms and courtrooms and community centers across the country, in schools implementing better policies and judges resisting pressure from wealth and young people choosing kindness over cruelty, the work continued. Marcus's work, Evelyn's work, Charlotte's work, even Ashton's work, flawed and incomplete but genuine. The work of breaking cycles. The work of justice. The work that, a century after that fateful trial, still mattered most of all.